And if you're standing, find a spot. Thank you. Great. I'll just let the last few people shuffle out who are leaving and the last few people coming in. Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming along to this public panel, which is going to be addressing the question of whether we should or should not tax sugary drinks. And I'd like to begin by thanking both the University of Victoria and also the Canadian Institutes for Health Research who are supporting this event this afternoon. Again, these kind of events can't happen without support from others, so we really do appreciate that. My name is David Crawford from Deakin University in Australia, and I'm very pleased to be chairing the session today. It's great that there's so many of you here from the International Society for Behavioural Nutrition and Physical Activity, but I suspect also many people from the local community and health professionals from the region. So we're going to be very blessed this afternoon to hear from three very eminent speakers who are experts in this topic, highly experienced and have done a lot of work in and around this issue. And our three speakers are going to be, and I'm going to get one of the names wrong, so apologies in advance, Tom Warshawski, Shulin Ung, and Harry Rutter. I'll introduce them each as they come up onto stage. What we're going to do is have each of the three present in turn, and then we're going to hold questions and discussion till the end. I believe they're planning to speak for about 15 minutes each, or thereabouts, and that'll give us plenty of time for discussion. We do need to finish on time because at least two of the presenters have to rush off and grab a flight back home. So without further ado, I will introduce Tom. Now, Tom is a consultant paediatrician here in British Columbia. He's currently the chair of the Childhood Obesity Foundation of Canada, and he's been very active in advocating for sugary drink taxation at both provincial and also at national level. So I guess Tom's going to spend the next 15 minutes and give us a perspective from a Canadian point of view. So please welcome Tom to the stage.
Thanks, David, and thank you all for staying at the end of the session like this. So I'm going to talk about taxing sugary drinks in Canada. And my disclosures are I have no industry sponsorship, but I did have a can of Coke on the plane on Thursday. I was after the 36 milligrams of caffeine. So when we talk about this in Canada, I'm always faced with a few questions. Number one is why target sugary drinks? What's so bad about sugary drinks in general? But also, what are sugary drinks? What do we know about sugary drink consumption patterns in Canada? What are the health implications for Canadians? What will a tax achieve? And what is the state of activity in Canada as we work towards a tax on sugary drinks? So first off, what is sugar? A lot of you already know this, but when we think about sugars, we're thinking about disaccharides. The smallest units are monosaccharides, and that's galactose, glucose, fructose, and maltose. Galactose and glucose, when they're paired together, is lactose. That's in mammal milk. And then glucose and fructose, when they're paired, is sucrose. So sucrose is a glucose-fructose mixture. They're paired, and it's a 50-50 ratio. That's the major sugar when we're thinking about sugar. When you look on the labels, you're seeing sucrose. But we also see a lot of high fructose corn syrup. So people say, what is high fructose corn syrup? How is it made? Well, it's corn syrup, which is naturally 100% glucose. It's enzymatically processed, so then it becomes a compilation or a mixture of glucose and fructose. And it's not necessarily all that high in fructose when compared to sucrose. So metabolically, they're probably the same. The high fructose corn syrups that's used in beverages is about 55% fructose. The high fructose corn syrup that's mixed into foods is about 42%. And then sugar, of course, is something that we all live on. Quite literally, glucose is what runs our bodies. And that's, of course, the primary or one of the primary monosaccharides in all this. But the glucose that we're designed to consume is in starches, so it's long polymers, and that's a whole different metabolic effect. So when we talk about sugars, what their form is, a monosaccharide versus a disaccharide, and how they're linked is very important. So I'm going to spend just a minute or so talking about the concept of bound versus free sugar. This is quite prominent in the World Health Organization recommendations, but also what constitutes sugary drinks as opposed to sugar-sweetened beverages. What exactly are we talking about and why? So if you look at the top, we're talking about naturally occurring sugars. And again, this is the stuff of life. We get milk sugars, that's lactose. But milk sugars inside milk, when it's mixed in with protein and fat, very slowly absorbed. And when things are absorbed slowly into our body, we actually know how to handle it quite well. But there's also sugar in intact fruits and vegetables. So we want to eat apples, we want to eat oranges, that sort of thing. But those sugars, the sucrose, the fructose, that are in these naturally occurring fruits and vegetables are bound up in the cell wall, bound up in the cells. And when we consume these, we chew them, we break them up, we release some free sugars, and then it gets into our stomach and then into the gut system, and it slowly comes on board. And again, that's actually a pretty healthy way for us to metabolize sugars. But what we've done, say in the last 100 years or so, is process these different sort of products. And then when we process them, we release free sugars. And I think the best example of this is juice. For a number of years, we used to say that a serving of juice was like a serving of fruit, and we know that's simply not the case, because when you take an orange or an apple and you pulverize it and you squeeze it down, you extract all the fluid that's in it, the sugars then are broken out of the context of the cells and the membranes, and they're basically floating in suspension in a liquid. So it's more like a sugar-sweetened beverage than it is an actual fruit. So when we think about those concentric circles, we get free sugars from processing, and then we're left with products with retained free sugars, so that's fruit juice and concentrate, but also honey. Honey is plant matter that's been processed by bees, and in essence, it's actually just a sticky syrup of sucrose and fructose. And maple syrup, which we love here in Canada, you take the sap from a maple tree, you boil it down, you supremely condense those sugars. So yeah, it's natural, but in fact, it's just probably as bad for you as a sugary drink. And then, of course, we have products with added sugars. That's what most of us think about as the bad guys. In Canada, 66% of processed food have added sugar to it, so it's very hard to escape this stuff. And of course, sugar-sweetened beverages, which are fluids which have added sugars added to it. So in that little dotted line there, fruit juice and concentrates and sugar-sweetened beverages constitute sugary drinks. They probably have the exact same metabolic effects and probably have the exact same relation with obesity and other heart disease or other diseases. But the best data right now is around sugar-sweetened beverages. So in different conversations and different speakers, you may hear people talk about sugar-sweetened beverages. Some of us will lump them all together as sugary drinks because physiologically they're pretty much the same. So with all that, what about sugary drinks, free sugars, and health? Well, we know that sugary drinks are basically free sugars dissolved in liquid. They have a very high caloric density, 0.4 calories per mil. So in Canada, quite commonly, what kids will buy is a 600 ml container of 590. So that's 240 calories of just liquid sugar. The problem is these are usually marketed as a thirst quencher, often to be consumed with meals. But the metabolic properties of this are that humans don't tend to compensate for liquid calories by reducing solid intake, and may even be stimulated to overeat. So when you sit down to eat your pizza and you have a glass of water, you might have 2 pieces of pizza. If you sit down to eat your pizza and you have a glass of Coke, you're going to have 2 pieces of pizza, but you've also got that 140 or 200 calories of sugar that's going to be stored as fat. But it gets worse than that, because when you swallow liquid sugar, that glucose that gets into your bloodstream very rapidly triggers an insulin response. So the body quite often overcompensates, secretes a great deal of insulin because it's not used to having bursts. It thinks it's going to get a big load of glucose over a prolonged period of time, but it's just got a burst. So what happens is you get a rebound lowering of blood sugar, hypoglycemia, you get hungry. So there's studies which demonstrate you actually eat more food over a 24-hour period when you've been drinking sugary drinks than you would if you were actually drinking water. So you get those calories from sugary drinks, plus you've been eating more. So this is bad stuff, and there's very strong and convincing evidence linking sugar-sweetened beverage consumption with obesity in children, youth, and adults. So Jeffrey Dunn, who's the past president of Coca-Cola North America before he saw the light, is quoted saying, you can look at obesity rates and you can look at per capita consumption of sugary soft drinks, overlay these on a map, and I promise you they correlate 99%. So the people in Coke, the people in Sprite, Pepsi, they know all this. There's a quote here from JAMA in 2004, reducing sugar-sweetened beverage consumption may be the best single opportunity we have to curb the obesity epidemic. And we know also that obesity is linked with numerous chronic disease, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, as of last count, 11 different cancers and strokes. But some people probably don't realize is that there's also a well-demonstrated link between sugar-sweetened beverage consumption and non-BMI mediated diseases. So regardless of BMI, you can't say, well, I'm healthy and I'm thin, I can go ahead and drink all this pop, it's not going to affect me. But in fact, it does. It affects a significant amount of the population in terms of it's a risk factor for coronary heart disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. So those two bottom ones are linked, of course, to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and dental caries. So it raises the question, is too much sugar toxic or poisonous? And those that look at this and are strong advocates for this idea is pointing out that fructose, which is glucose and fructose are the elements inside high fructose corn syrup as well as in sucrose. Fructose is a non-essential molecule, and we have not evolved to deal with high doses of fructose. What happens when we consume sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, the fructose gets broken off, goes directly to the liver. The liver doesn't know what to do with it. It turns it into a lipid. And as we may know, not all lipids are good for you. The lipids then get secreted into the bloodstream. It leads to atherosclerosis and heart disease. But sometimes the liver is overwhelmed. It can't excrete it fast enough. And in fact, you get fatty liver. And this is the major epidemic of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. That's fatty livers in children. It's going to be a huge problem for us over the next 2 or 3 decades. In addition, the metabolites, as we break down fructose, these metabolites cause insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. These metabolites also raise uric acid and cause hypertension. So it raises the question, what is the safe threshold for fructose? And we really don't know, actually. So based on the fact that we know that sugary drinks and sugar-sweetened beverages are so detrimental to health, the World Health Organization has come up with some fairly distinct recommendations. They say to reduce the intake of free sugars throughout the lifespan, limit the free sugar intake to less than 10% of daily calories, and that's not very much. That's 250 calories for men, 200 for women, 15 teaspoons or 12 teaspoons respectively. Again, knowing that in Canada, 66% of processed food already have sugar, and then you're getting this on top of it. And they're saying that the World Health Organization consider limiting your total sugar intake to less than 5%. This is a total non-essential ingredient and has no vitamins, and we have caloric excess in most countries. I mentioned that free sugars are everywhere. This is just a list of all the fine print that you may see when you pick up a package and trying to decipher what is actually a free sugar or not. In Canada, at least, this is going to improve. Health Canada is talking about new labeling. So instead of having sugars distributed throughout the ingredient list, maybe at the bottom, scattered throughout, they're all going to be clumped together under the broad rubric of sugar. So you at least have a better idea of how much sugar is in that product. So in Canada, again, added free sugars account to 11 to 13% of calories that Canadians consume. And I also want to say, when we talk about this in terms of averages, there are some people that never drink sugar-sweetened beverages, so those that drink this product get a lot. That already exceeds the World Health Organization recommendation. A single 350 ml can of pop has at least 9 teaspoons of free sugar. Sugary drinks contain little, well, that's fruit juice, they have a little bit of vitamins sprinkled in, to no nutrition if it's a sugar-sweetened beverages. And we know that sugary drinks are the single largest contributor of added sugar to the diet of Canadians. And I think this goes worldwide. The simplest way to reduce free sugar intake is to reduce sugary drink consumption. So in Canada, what are we doing? Well, the average based on sales is 444 meals per day. Again, that's average. We know that 20% of youth report that they hardly ever drink sugary drinks. 40% of adults have a similar report. Those that drink this stuff are drinking a lot. And you can see that youth report on average 578 meals per day. And I have to attribute the source here. Amanda Jones is in the audience. They did great work, Amanda, Verman, and Hammond, on this report that they released in March. And I'm going to have a few more slides from their work as well. So what's the actual health impact on our society here in Canada? And again, it's probably more in places like Chile and in Mexico and the US where the consumption patterns are much higher. We know that in Canada, more than 1 million Canadians over the next 25 years will become overweight, and 3 million obese because of sugary drink intake, 1 million cases of type 2 diabetes, 300,000 with heart disease, 100,000 cases of cancer, 40,000 strokes, and probably 63,000 premature deaths over the next 25 years due to sugary drink intake. It's not, of course, not beyond, but the most important thing, of course, is the health impact, but there's a significant economic impact on this. This is the externality of the product, the actual societal costs that the consumption of this product impacts on our society, but it's not built into the price. So the total healthcare spending attributable to sugary drink intake in Canada next 25 years is $50 billion. Those other numbers are less if you just restrict it to sugary drink or to sugar sweetened beverages. But again, physiologically, there's no reason to do that. So why talk tax at all? Because price matters. This is a graph of a highly addictive substance, tobacco, in Canada, consumption versus price. And you can see the brown line there is the consumption over the last sort of 2 or 3 decades. As taxes increase, price increase, we had a direct sort of linear drop off in consumption. In Canada, there was a flare of cigarette smuggling. Government reacted by dropping the tax in sort of the mid-1990s. When they dropped the tax, the price went down, consumption went up, put the tax back up again, and consumption went down. Big Beverage is very aware of this. This is why in the US they're spending $10 to $20 million a year fighting every initiative to put a tax on sugary drinks. So what would a tax achieve? Well, here in Canada, or actually in anywheres, excise taxes are preferred over sales tax because the price differential is obvious at the shelf. If you're trying to shape behavior, you want someone who's looking at the shelf price to see that the low-cal or no-cal sugary drink, or drink rather, beverage is less expensive than the sugared property. If it's a sales tax and applied at the cashier, you're not aware until it's too late. You want to see it at the shelf, and that's where an excise tax comes in. The Canadian Constitution dictates only the federal government can implement excise taxes. Provinces can do sales taxes, which aren't as effective in shaping behavior. You can still bring in money, but it's not going to shape behavior. So what would a tax do? Well, Shoin's going to speak to this, and there's very clear data. That tax will discourage consumption. Therefore, we can think it's going to assume it's going to reduce disease burden. It's going to capture that societal cost, that externality, the cost that it exerts on society, and as importantly, provide funds for health promotion. Here in Canada, Amanda and her group has estimated what a 20% excise tax would do. It would reduce overweight and obesity by 700,000 cases, over 200,000 cases of diabetes, 20,000 cancer cases. It would save us $11 billion in healthcare spending and generate $43 billion in revenue. So what are we doing here in British Columbia? Unfortunately, not that much. Here in BC, we have a value-added tax, a provincial sales tax, but it currently exempts sugary drinks. So this is a product that triggers more than its fair share of healthcare costs, but it's not even paying that share that everyone else does. We have a select standing committee on finance, which is all-party, nonpartisan, that has recommended the last 2 years that we explore lifting that exemption on sugary drinks on the PST, but as yet we have no progress. In Canada, our government is aware that the World Health Organization has called upon member states to consider taxing sugary drinks. All the major health-oriented NGOs have advised our country to put a tax on sugary drinks. The Canadian Senate has a great report on obesity. They've recommended to the federal government, the House of Commons, that we enact an excise tax on sugary drinks. And one of our territories, the Northwest Territories, has announced that they're going to move towards a tax on sugary drinks as well. But unfortunately for our federal government, it's not a priority at this time. And when we talk to them, these are the reasons they give. One is that they're concerned that we shouldn't focus on sugary drinks. There's so many things that cause this problem. Why are you picking on the poor beverage industry? Well, I think hopefully this talk has helped illuminate that this is a spectacularly bad product, strongly linked with ill health. They say there's limited public awareness of the problem. PJ wrote an op-ed in the Victoria Times Colonist. We try to get our message out as much as possible, and hopefully all of you can spread the word as well. There's a concern regarding job losses. This is bad for industry. Shoin will talk about this. And what we hear over and over, I think worldwide, is about this is regressive taxation. It hits the poor the hardest. And it's true, any tax will hit those that have less money the most. But sugary drinks are not essential items. This is everyone can do without it. A healthier thirst quencher and hydration source is available for free in most communities. That's water, ideally tap water. In Canada, oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, the highest level of support for sugary drink taxation is amongst the lowest socioeconomic group. They see how it's ravaging their community, especially if the proceeds go towards health promotion. So a sugary drink tax would be progressive for health, certainly, as low-income groups are disproportionately affected by obesity and type 2 diabetes, especially First Nations. In Canada, I don't know how it works in Australia with the First Nations population there, but 90% of Aboriginal women will develop type 2 diabetes by the time they're 60 years old. So it's just ravaging their community. And the evidence is that sugary drinks don't actually increase household expenditures because people will shift their purchases to water and other products. So our next steps here in Canada are we're continuing to inform our provincial government. We have a new government of the need to lift that exemption on PSD. We're considering forming a formal coalition of our NGOs to promote effectively a tax on sugary drinks. And we want to increase public and government awareness of the health effects of sugary drinks, associated costs, the usefulness of taxation, the limited impact on employment, and the fact that a tax would be progressive for health and not regressive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that perspective from Canada and from the region particularly. Now, Tom's going to relax up here on stage, although I don't know what's relaxed about sitting up on a stage in front of 500 people, but enjoy yourself there. Our second speaker is Shuwen Ung, who is a health economist from the University of North Carolina. And Shuwen has done a lot of work evaluating regulatory policies such as taxation, but other things like quotas and nutrition labelling, amongst other things. And she's going to join me on stage to talk about what happens to consumer purchases and sales after a sugary tax drink and give us an international perspective. So please welcome her to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I'm going to jump right into it. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And Tom has already done a fantastic job explaining why it is necessary to tax sugary drinks. But if you don't believe him, I'm sure you would buy the argument from the father of economics, Adam Smith, who said, sugar, rum, tobacco are commodities of which are nowhere necessities of life, but which are objects of almost universal consumption and which are therefore extremely proper subjects of taxation. So I'm not going to spend more time talking about why we need to tax sugary beverages, but instead just jump right into some of the evidence that we've been finding internationally on how taxing sugary beverages may have changed purchases as well as sales, providing some examples from Mexico and Berkeley, and then doing some summaries of what we have learned to date, but also what we have still to learn, and some major takeaways. So some of the initial work looking at how purchases or sales of sugary drinks might change in response to a tax have really been originally more model-based because none of the policies have been implemented until in more recent years. The focus on these models have really been on sugary sweetened beverages, and in fact the taxes that have been implemented have also purely been on sugar sweetened beverages, meaning that they have excluded fruit juices for the most part, actually in all cases. And in these cases, these are all models looking at excise taxes, which Tom did a good job explaining as well, which are levied on producers and manufacturers. These models assume that there's what we call 100% pass-through of the tax onto prices that the consumers see, with no counteraction on the industry's end. So these are, you have to make some assumptions when you're doing modeling, and the assumption here is that this is static, the environment is static, and the industry is not going to come up with some counter moves. So in Mexico, some of the earlier models looked at what a 10% increase in price might result in, and they found about 11 to 12% reduction in purchases. And in a meta-analysis, it was found, in the US particularly, found that a 10% increase in price is modeled to result between a 6 to a 12% reduction in purchases of sugar-sweetened beverages. And as a whole, the evidence suggests that there is a need for at least a 20% excise tax on sugar-sweetened beverages in order to have a meaningful meaningful impact on lowering sugar-sweetened beverage intake. Now I'm going to move on to provide some real-world experiences from Mexico and Berkeley. And in Mexico, it has one of the world's highest prevalence of diabetes and sugar-sweetened beverages. In 2012, Mexico's per capita intake of sugar-sweetened beverages was 163 liters per year. So since January 1st of 2014, the government instituted a Mexican peso per liter tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, which works out to be between 9 and 10%. This was an excise tax. Concurrently, they implemented an 8% junk food tax on high-energy dense products. This was a national tax that was across the country starting January 1st of 2014, so there's no appropriate comparison group. And I bring this up because this affects how we go about doing the evaluation. Our approach to this was to conduct a multi-year evaluation design study to look at first the price changes on sugary beverages as well as untaxed beverages to see to what degree the price was actually passed through to these products and whether or not it was uniformed. And then to look at changes in purchases and sales, whether they changed meaningfully and how long they last. And then eventually to look at health changes in terms of weight and cardiometabolic measures. Currently, because these taxes are still relatively new, many of the work around the health impacts are really just model-based at this point. But by 2020, we expect to have some empirical results from the Health and Nutrition Survey in Mexico from 2018. So let's jump into the results from prices. So here you see that in the urban areas, on average, in the green bar, the pass-through was pretty much complete. So the horizontal line shows the 100% pass-through. If it's below, you've undershifted, and if it's above, you've overshifted. But if you break it down by the beverage types shown by blue versus yellow, and then also by the package sizes within these beverage types by the different patterns of the bars, you'll see that there's actually high variability in terms of how the prices were passed through. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this might be happening, but the main takeaway here is that industry has a lot of leeway, and they can decide how they want to cost shift this price increase across the portfolios of products that they produce, both in terms of the types of beverages, but also the package sizes of these beverages. So from that, we know on average the price did go on to consumers. They saw the price increase. And we wanted to see then how that affected the purchases. And to do this, we took into account the fact that there were already some pre-existing trends in the purchases of these sugar-sweetened beverages. And so we wanted to account for that in looking at how that changed after the tax was implemented. And we looked at purchases of both taxed sugary drinks and untaxed drinks, overall the entire population, urban population, and by socioeconomic status. We used data from the Nielsen Household Purchase Panel of urban households between January of 2012 and December of 2015. There's a typo in here. Adjusting for a number of pre-existing trends, as I mentioned, and a number of other characteristics of these households, as well as the economic situation in Mexico. So graphically, this is how we're going about this evaluation, taking into account the pre-tax trend, projecting that out into the post-tax period, and then comparing what we observe in the post-tax period in the red line to that black dotted line. So this was the main results in the first year of the tax. So the average sugar-sweetened beverage purchase was 6% lower in the first year of the tax compared to that counterfactual, while the average untaxed beverage purchases actually increased. So there was some substitution that we observed. And then when we broke it down by the various socioeconomic household levels, low, medium, and high, we saw a much more pronounced reduction in the low-income households by about 9% compared to only about 2% in the high-income households. And we now actually have 2 years of post-tax data in Mexico, and we repeated the same analysis with 2 years post-tax data. And we saw that actually in the second year of the tax, the reduction on average was even higher, averaging a 10% reduction in the year 2 for an average over the 2-year period of about an 8% reduction. When we look at sales data in Mexico from their manufacturing public data using interrupted time series analysis, we found very consistent results in terms of sales. So 6% reduction in the first year, 9% reduction in the second year, and then going into the third year, close to 10% reduction. At the same time, about a 7% increase in the sales of bottled water. From these results, other researchers in Mexico have then used these results to do some model-based estimates on the health and cost savings associated with the sugary beverage tax in Mexico. And these numbers are quite impressive. So there are two studies right now. I'm not going to go into the details here, but basically large savings in prevention of type 2 diabetes cases, fewer incidences of stroke, reductions in obesity prevention, with larger reductions expected for the lower SES socioeconomic households, given that there are reductions in purchases and therefore presumably intake of sugary beverages are higher both in absolute and relative terms. Next, I'm going to give some examples from Berkeley in the US. So Berkeley, California was the first location in the US to institute a sugar sweetened beverage tax. This was at 1 cent per fluid ounce that started in March of 2015. And so for this evaluation, we looked at a number of different outcome measures, including the beverage prices, the store point of sale volume, and then also store revenue, or the other way to look at it is grocery bills on the consumer end. And again, we did a pre-post analysis of this policy in Berkeley. So the first thing we wanted to look at was the tax pass-through onto prices, the same way we did it in Mexico. And what to keep in mind is that the tax is levied on the distributor, and it's not clear how the distributor might pass it on to retailers, and then how retailers pass it on to consumers. We don't see that relationship in terms of the pass-through from distributor to retailer to consumer. We miss that middle part. But what we're observing is just what the consumers might see. And we found that there was mixed results. There was complete pass-through in the large and small chain supermarkets and the chain gas stations, but only partial pass-through in pharmacies and negative pass-through, actually, in the independent corner stores and independent gas stations. And then moving on from that, we looked at store point of sales for taxed beverages and untaxed beverages. For taxed beverages, we found that in Berkeley stores, there was a reduction of almost 10% in sales, but in non-Berkeley stores, there was an increase of 7%. And for untaxed beverages, we saw an increase in sales of untaxed beverages in Berkeley stores by 3.5% and a very small increase in non-Berkeley stores. Much of this was driven by bottled water, with a much larger increase in Berkeley stores by about 16%. So I would argue that in the case of Berkeley, we're seeing a triple win. We're seeing an increase in the price of SSBs, but this does vary by store type in terms of the timing of this coming in. In the larger grocery chains, we saw SSB sales falling, but untaxed beverage sales rising, such that overall beverage sales actually rose slightly. As a result, there was actually no change in the store revenue or grocery bill spending in Berkeley stores. So there was no impact on the retailer. And there was actually a fourth win as well, which is the use of the revenue in Berkeley. So the tax actually generated $13 per capita in year one within Berkeley. And Measure D, which was the campaign for the tax to pass in Berkeley, included a creation of a panel of experts which determined how the revenue, part of the job is to determine how the revenue from this tax is being used. And there's a transparent way in which this is being announced, and so here are a list of some of the ways this revenue is being used. There's actually also some funding that's being put towards independently evaluating these funded programs as well. I'm also wanting to speak about the potential change in employment from instituting these taxes. And in some work by my collaborator in Mexico, Arantxa Colchero, she looked in the case of Mexico, looking at monthly and quarterly data on overall unemployment and employment across different sectors, and basically found that there was no meaningful effect of employment after the tax was implemented. She looked at a number of different data sources, and they all gave her basically the same result. In separate work in the US, focusing on California and Illinois, Lisa Powell at the University of Illinois Chicago did a microeconomic simulation model on the employment effect. And again, found almost no effect. There was actually an increase in employment of 0.06% in Illinois and 0.03% in California. This is because the declines in employment within the beverage industry is being more than offset by new employment in non-beverage industry and government sectors. So what do these findings in Mexico and Berkeley suggest? So first, industry can pass through differentially to cost shift across their portfolio. There's also, in terms of the price responsiveness, we are seeing, at least in the case of Mexico, this is growing over time. And the lower income individuals and households are more price responsive, meaning that actually this tax effort is progressive for health, especially if the tax is going to be used wisely. Taxes can dampen the demand for sugary drinks and shift the demand to healthier alternatives. We saw the increase in bottled water sales in particular. And there was no net change in unemployment due to the substitutions and the offsetting effects. These results were really robust. We've done a number of different studies using different data sets across a number of different locations, and we're finding very similar results. So it's not surprising that we're seeing that SSB taxes are gaining momentum around the world. And another country that recently is in the works of implementing a tax is the UK and Ireland. Their design is quite different than in Mexico and in Berkeley, which is based on volume. In Ireland and the UK, this is based on a sugar amount that's tiered, as illustrated here. This was announced in March of 2016 and is set to start April 1st of 2018. It does exclude 100% fruit juices as well, and also milk-based drinks that may have sugars, and also exempts some of the smaller producers. And the goal around the design in this case was to encourage reformulation, and there's some evidence that this may already be happening. So I just want to round up my talk by saying that there is a need to, especially as more locations and countries implement sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, to continue evaluating them and to see how they might be working alongside other policies that may be also occurring. There is a need to continue building this evidence base, consider other policy tools and designs and how they might work with each other, such as unifying definitions of what's being taxed. And then also the various tax designs is important to consider. What are the pros and cons of each of the designs given the context? And there are other policies that should be considered as well, and I think Harry will talk a lot more about these other options to consider with regards to marketing regulations, nutrition profiling and labeling, particularly front of pack to help inform consumers, and then what kinds of products should be allowed to be sold in certain locations such as schools. So to summarize, I just want you to take these 3 main points along with you. I talked for a while, so if you don't remember anything, just remember these 3 points. Basically, taxing sugary drinks can work to change supply and demand. The design, given the context, matters due to how industry and consumers can or might respond. And the revenues should be reinvested towards improving related policies to maximize impact. I would like to end just by acknowledging my collaborators and funders from UNC, Mexico's National Institute for Public Health, Berkeley's Public Health Institute, and our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies and RWJF and the US NIH. Thank you.
Thank you, Shu Wen. We're going to keep moving. Our third speaker before we open up for questions and discussion is Dr. Harry Rutter, who's a public health physician from Oxford in England. He's acted as a senior advisor to Public Health England, and he's going to be addressing the question of what is so complex about sugary drink taxes. So please welcome Harry to the stage.
Thank you. I'm amazed there's anyone still here. I thought there were going to be three of us, and it would be this three. Yeah. So this is a really difficult area, I think, because the more you look at it, the harder it gets to work out exactly what's going on. And I'm working with a team, and I'm not so good at acknowledgements as the others, but I've got the names on one slide, led by Martin White, who I think is here somewhere, at the back, where we're trying to grapple with how do you make sense of the even harder bits, you know, the fantastic stuff we've already heard, but how do you make sense of the even harder bits than that? So if you can bear with me for the last 15 minutes of the conference, from a jet-lagged Englishman, we'll see what we can do. So, as you've already heard, this stuff's taking off. Seattle was announced when? Yeah. A week ago? 3 days ago? There's a movement taking place around the world, even in the land of the free, where stuff like this is getting taxed. And this wouldn't have happened 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, it's really extraordinary, I think, this shift in policy. And we've got one coming in England. And in England, they've fudged it, so it's not quite directly hypothecated, but effectively the money that's raised by our sugary drinks tax is going to be ploughed back into schools. Unfortunately, probably into school sport, which will do nothing about obesity, but hey. And as you know, anyone here not produce a logic model when you put a project together? Put your hand up if you don't produce logic models. You know, there's a logic model for what goes on. It's pretty straightforward. Bring in a tax, the price goes up. The only evidence, I believe, that is needed to justify the introduction of a sugary drinks tax is the existence of price elasticity of demand for this step here. Except for some extreme luxury goods, if you put up the price of something, people buy less of it. That's all the evidence you need to bring in a sugar tax, surely. Just this step here. Anyway, you get fewer sales, reduce consumption, reduce obesity. Pretty straightforward stuff, isn't it? Well, the sugary drinks industry doesn't think that. So Gavin Partington, who's the director of the British Soft Drinks Association, is quite cross about this. He said there's no evidence worldwide that tax has an impact on levels of obesity. And this is a fairly standard trope from industry. They're working hard to underplay the evidence on this. However, they're also responding. And we've already seen something like 1/3 of soft drinks in the country have reformulated or are reformulating. I think Tesco's, our biggest supermarket, all of their own brand drinks are going to fit below the threshold, if they don't already. So, and we haven't even got the law in place. It's already having an impact. Because of that, actually, we're not going to raise 415 million now. We think it's going to be about 385 million, so that'll be slightly fewer sports kits and things. But, you know, the system is already responding, and this is just in response to the law being announced. It's not even in place. And then we get the industry pushback. I mean, this isn't the UK, this is Portugal, but apparently, and I don't think ground had been broken yet, but apparently Coca-Cola had massive plans for investment for a 40 million euro bottling plant in Portugal that magically got cancelled when the threat of a sugary drinks tax appeared. So, we come back to our logic model, which perhaps actually looks a bit more like this. Because, and I don't know if it shows, but I've tried to make it get weaker and weaker as it comes across, as more and more stuff gets imposed on this, because every step here is subject to some kind of influence. And when something like this law gets announced, then, you know, even in advance of it getting announced, there's a huge pushback from industry, the vested interests that are threatened by this. And Coca-Cola, so the general manager, John Wood, general manager of Coca-Cola in Great Britain, he's even crosser than Gavin Partington. And he's telling us that there's no reliable evidence from anywhere in the world that shows that taxing food or drink, let alone just some soft drinks, has changed people's behavior and made them thinner. And he's right. Because I think it's pretty delusional to think that taxing sugary drinks, one small part of the food that we eat, is going to have an impact on population levels of obesity. Because the system is a complex, adaptive system. And it's not just industry that adapts, it's us as individuals who adapt. The whole thing adapts. If you change one part of the system, other bits shift around in response to that. The question is not, do we have a simple single-line logic model, and if you do things at one end, you know what's going to come out the other end, and there's a direct relation between taxing, you know, a 10 or 20% tax on sugar drinks and obesity prevalence. It's not, does this thing work to fix that problem? Actually, to solve this problem, we need a jigsaw puzzle with 200 or 300 or 400 pieces, and this is a few of those pieces. So the question then isn't, does this solve the whole jigsaw puzzle in one go? It's, is this a piece of the jigsaw puzzle? Does it do more good than harm? Does it have any unintended consequences? If so, what might we do about them? Are there some things we might want to do to make this more effective? Are there some things we might want to stop happening that otherwise would make it less effective? And so on and so forth. So if you think about this in those kinds of terms, you can see why the guy from Coca-Cola is absolutely right. It's not going to affect it in that direct way, but that doesn't mean it's not a helpful and valuable and important, let alone, in terms of internalizing the external costs, economically and ethically appropriate intervention. And one way to think about this is to think about building a wall of sandbags against a flood. And effectively, flood prevention, to use nerdy systems language, flood prevention is an emergent property of a wall of sandbags. If you take one sandbag on its own, it doesn't stop the flood. But you put them all together, and you can. And the trouble with a lot of our research is that we take one sandbag out, and we test it to see if it stops the flood. And when we find it doesn't, we say this thing doesn't work. And I think that's a problem, because I think we're potentially handing an opportunity to the opponents by doing that, because we set ourselves up for failure by expecting any one sandbag on its own to stop the whole flood. Sorry, I need to get a drink. But I said I was going to talk about complexity. And there's another aspect to this, which isn't just about having lots of things that fit together, the jigsaw puzzle thing. That's complicated. But it's what happens when you go a step beyond that to something that's complex. And the best illustration I like here is the difference between a Saturn V rocket, very, very complicated. We could build one, maybe. It looks like the ceiling here might even come away. We could put it in here and point it up to the moon. And if you know what you're doing, you put 3 people in the top there, we send them to the moon, and 5 days later, we know exactly where to pick them up from, out in the harbour. We can go and find them with a couple of minutes' warning. You know, we'll know exactly where they are. Geopolitical relationships in the Middle East, however, and you'll be pleased that Palestine and Israel were left off this for the sake of simplicity, present a different category of problem. And although there are some people who would you can't. And if you interfere in one part of this system, the system adapts around that, reshapes, and what you get is a differently aligned system. You don't solve the problem. And that's what we have the equivalent of in the food system. If you reshape one part of the food system, it realigns, it adapts, it fixes itself, it works around the problem, and you end up with a differently aligned food system. You don't solve it. And getting to grips with that in terms of the ways in which we think and understand about how our interventions work, it seems to me, is really important if we're really going to make sense of what's going on here. Because otherwise I think we're at risk of oversimplifying and time again finding that the things we're doing appear not to work when actually they might well be incredibly helpful. So the challenge then is, how do we not just have this lovely world in which every public health intervention we think, oh yeah, that'll probably work, and we just let it get away with it. The challenge is how we build robust science and objectivity into answering those kinds of questions when we probably don't yet have the tools to do it. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in our evaluation. So instead of sticking to this rather simple logic model, this is what we've produced as one of the first stages of how we're going to evaluate the sugary drinks tax in England. And there's the team named at the bottom. And you probably can't read this. It doesn't matter because it's still a work in progress. But the point here is that we're trying to take account of all the things that Shu Wen was talking about, and probably a couple of others as well, and we're trying to build in a time dimension and allow for the fact that things will change over time, and so on and so forth. And then what one can see is, how does the system adapt? And when we see changes that we might or might not expect, we might be able to explain them with a bit more detail, with a bit more insight, with a bit more understanding. And we've not done this before. We'll see how it goes. I happen to believe that this kind of approach is necessary, but we'll see how it goes in the end. And come back and look at us in 3 years' time and see what we've made of it. So you don't need me to read these conclusions, but I think the points here that I would really pull out are probably the two in the middle. To see the obesity epidemic, not these silly, sterile fights. Is it diet or physical activity? I mean, God, why would we have these fights? The obesity epidemic is an emergent property of the worlds, the systems within which we exist. And it's a bit of everything. More in some than others, more in some contexts than others, but it all fits together. And once we get that, then we can start to conceptualize these interventions as events within systems, not as hammers applied to nails. And I think that when we can start to do that, we might start to make much more sense of what's going on in these messy, difficult, challenging public health problems. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, I think we've had 3 really interesting and thought-provoking talks, and we've now got an opportunity for questions and discussion. And there is a microphone over here. And Antonio, I wonder if you could jog to the back, because you're the fittest of all of us, and pick up the, whatever we call those, the dice microphones that we can pass around or throw around. But I invite Kim Gans, I think it is it, in the distance there, to fire off with the first question. And our speakers are all mic'd up, so away you go.
I had a question for any of you to answer. Along with many of these taxes, they haven't occurred alone. A lot of them occurred with campaigns, with marketing campaigns, to try to sort of soften the public, either before the tax or during the tax. And I've actually read some people arguing that maybe the Berkeley results weren't due to the tax, they were due to this marketing campaign that occurred before and possibly during as well. So I was just wondering if some of you could speak to that, this issue of these sort of marketing campaigns that are going on, and can we tease out the effects of those versus the effects of the tax?
Who's going to take it?
Sure, Tom has made me take it. Yes, we can't, from our evaluations, tease that out. But I think maybe really the answer to that question is, does it matter?
Well, I mean, the soda industry is, I mean, I've read them saying, oh, it was the campaign, it wasn't the tax, so the taxes shouldn't be, you know, they're using it as an argument. So I, as a public health person, I don't think it matters, but the soda industry is using it as an argument.
Jump in, Tom.
Sure. So I'm a clinician primarily. I work with kids and I work in obesity clinics, that sort of thing. So I feel quite strongly that that is an important signal. People are generally unaware of the negative health consequences of sugary drinks. The tax itself sends that signal. People think about it. And for most North Americans, to be honest, that extra 10 or 20 cents isn't that much. It's not going to break the bank. But then they're thinking about it. They ask me about it. And then they have dramatic reductions in their intake. So I think more along the individual, and Harry and Shuan, you guys bring more of the population base. But I know what I see in my clinic, and people respond to that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that we'd hope to examine. I don't think any of us can pull that out exactly, including the soft drinks industry. So I'd want to know what their evidence is for their claim.
Okay, other questions from the floor? There's over there, there's Antonio. Can you throw it?
Okay, try.
You're supposed to jog. All right, now I think you just talk into the top of it.
Hi, Anya Mistrek from the University of Otago. I think it's great that we have a session about one of these many puzzle pieces, but I think that one of the difficulties is working out in a particular context, like Harry was saying, what are all of those puzzle pieces and which puzzle pieces we put in which order, given that there's a limited number of public health professionals and we're all trying to get the best interventions. I was just wondering whether you could speak to how you think we work out, given that we have maybe 20 different puzzle pieces of an obesity intervention or an obesity policy, how you think we can work out which ones to implement when and how?
Well, I think that actually a lot of it has to do with what's politically feasible in the particular context at any given point in time. So I don't think there is a formula for sequencing of these puzzle pieces. Yeah, that's my take.
So I've done a bit of work on this stuff, and so I was doing some work in London on what was not allowed, we weren't allowed to call it a strategy, but it was effectively an obesity strategy for London. And we were thinking in terms of a 20-year vision, a 5-year strategy to fit within a political cycle, and then a 1-year plan. And we had some stuff that was backstage, and backstage we had messy conversations about complex adaptive systems and all sorts of nerdy stuff like that. Boris Johnson was Mayor of London at the time. He did not want to hear a 15-minute disquisition on complex adaptive systems. Boris Johnson wanted to know, what do I do now? So front of house, we had that backstage. Front of house, you got two things you tell Boris. And the way, or any politician, and that's entirely appropriate. That's how politicians function. And it's the job of their advisors to give them good advice. And the point there should be that the things that you put out as the guidance make sense both in terms of the 5-year strategy and the 20-year vision. Mm-hmm. So they've got to have some face validity for what they're going to achieve now. But if you're thinking in system terms, what they might be doing is not very much on their own, but laying the foundation for what you're going to do in 3, 4, 5, or 10 years' time. Yeah. If you just leap to what are we going to do tomorrow, you miss out on that long-term planning. And I think it's really important to have a bit of both.
And how did you get everybody to agree on the two things that you were going to tell Boris? What was that? What was the secret there?
Well, lots of stuff backstage, lots of consultation, lots of discussion, but exactly as Shuan says, political pragmatism. The standard thing is the foresight. I didn't show it, obviously. The foresight map of obesity, a bowl of spaghetti. How do you eat a bowl of spaghetti? You stick your fork in and start somewhere. It doesn't really matter where.
Tom, anything to add?
I would say the success we've had right now in Canada is
Tom,
through
you might have to just pull your mic up a bit higher.
sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
The success we've had here in Canada is based on coalition building. So I gave you that list of NGOs that are working on sugary drinks taxation, but we have that's the same groups that have worked on stop marketing to kids. So we have a bill before the Senate now. We hope it's going to go before the House. We couldn't have got there until we got all the NGOs in a room. It was a 2-year process to say, okay, what exactly are we asking for? And then once we get our act together, that's that backstage stuff, then you go to policymakers and you don't say, I'm not too sure if this will work. It's pretty complicated. Here's the far sight diagram. You got to say, we have our Boruses. You have to say, this is best evidence. We're going to go for it. World Health Organization says it's good. And that you got to be very promoting on this.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from over here.
Catherine Bacolo, Deakin University. I was just wondering, Harry, in your systems diagram, if you considered price promotions, because in Australia we've been looking at price promotions on drinks, beverages every single week, and sugary drinks are on sale in pretty much every week, and on average about 40% reduction, which may somewhat undermine a 10 or 20% sugary drinks tax. So I was wondering if you considered that in your systems diagram, and if there's any appetite for intervention there.
Did we, Martin? I'm sure we did. I can't remember. Is Tara here? I'm sure we did, and if we didn't, we'll add it.
I'm pretty sure you did.
I'm sure we did.
Shu-Wen's read the work.
I'm sure it's in there. I just have to go and have a look to be certain.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Moira Smith. I'm from the University of Otago in Wellington in New Zealand. I trained as a dentist and worked as a clinical dentist for a number of years before entering public health. And the common risk factor approach here, of course, is thinking about the sugar content. And in all of these conversations that I hear about sugary drinks tax particularly, there's no mention about dental caries, or very rarely. And, you know, there's always this comment about the lag time in terms of child obesity and the difficulty of showing the health outcome in terms of any of these interventions. And I don't know if I have a question or more of a comment, but I was just wondering if that has ever come up in terms of what you've been measuring. And, you know, you can destroy a mouth in 3 months with sugar, particularly. It takes much longer for us to see the effects of obesity, particularly around type 2 diabetes. So maybe a comment or a question if somebody would like to comment on that.
I'll start off, and I'm sure others will join in as well. I did have dental caries on there, and it was at the bottom of my slide. And the reason, I guess, why is that? The World Health Organization, in terms of the recommendations, around 10 and 5%. Dental caries is one of the biggest bodied evidence, so the evidence is there. In BC, the #1 cause for surgery for children is dental caries. It's a huge, huge problem, and it's linked with that. When you go talk to the politicians and you want to get some action, it doesn't seem to resonate as much. So I guess maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe we have to, when we talk to parents, involve them more. But we also had the Canadian Dental Association involved with us in terms of lobbying groups. So a point well taken. I'm not 100% sure where we don't make it more prominent, but it's a big issue.
Yeah, I'm mea culpa. It's probably because I'm an obesity nerd, not a tooth nerd. But it was a very important element in the introduction of the sugary drinks tax in England. It was an important policy motivator.
I think just as a comment from a professional perspective, I think a lot of it has to do around the value of oral health. And I think as a profession, we have, as a dentist, we have a greater obligation to try and advocate for improving the value, for getting people to see a greater value in oral health as well. Yeah. And often it's hidden too, you know, I mean, we can see obesity quite clearly, whereas the impact of dental caries and just its physical manifestation is often much more difficult to see.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, so
I think we'll go to the DICE microphone for the next question. Yep.
Hi, my name is Mats. I have 2 questions. For Shu-Wen first, have you looked, or has there been any sort of talk about looking at large-scale agricultural policies or taxation for all of those sugar substrates, just not in terms of sugary beverages, but also addition or an excise tax to corporations that add sugar to their products in the States? or Canada or Mexico?
No, I'm trying to decide if you're referring to some kind of a tariff tax or import-export type tax, or are you referring to just the use of...
Sorry, taxes outside of sugary beverages. Has there been
So sugar,
products?
purely on sugar, not just on, on beverages alone, but any use of sugar.
Exactly.
There have been modeling studies that have looked at, so Sanjay Basu over in Stanford has done some modeling studies where basically it's taking the same kind of approach in carbon taxes, where you cap and trade approach on sugars, to see what that would mean in terms of changes in diabetes and other cardiovascular diseases. But it's all been model-based. There's been no policies built around that. It would require an entire industry-based approach. And you know, the implementation would be much more challenging than something like a targeted
just sugary
product.
drinks.
Yeah.
Right.
Your second question?
The second question was sort of wondering, in all of your guys' practice, shifting the message away from obesity and targeting more towards the chronic disease side of things, if that's something that's being targeted by your organizations.
Yeah, so I've got that's a whole other hour to talk about. But I think obesity is an incredibly important driver, but the language around obesity, I think, is often very unhelpful. It's often linked in with very stigmatizing imagery. The whole discourse is around people at the top end of the scale. That gets people to see this as a kind of dichotomous, binary thing. You're either obese or you're not. Gets us miles away from what we need to be doing, which is thinking about this as a shifting a population curve, shifting a distribution, Jeffrey Rose's kind of work. So I think much more of obesity is the core driver of this, but actually a lot of what needs to be done is should be much more based around healthy diets and physical activity.
Tom.
So I'm with the Childhood Obesity Foundation, and we thought for a long time, should we use this potentially pejorative name? Back in the early 2000s, it was more acceptable than it is now. And in fact, we've shifted our message away from weight altogether. It's about healthy eating, active living. We know that up to 20% of people with class 3 obesity are fully metabolically healthy. 30% of those say that are class 1 obesity. So there's something more than just obesity. You can be so-called fit and fat. So let's actually talk about what makes you fit, and that's healthy eating, active living, and less focus on weight.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Martin White from Cambridge. Just to respond to a couple of points there, I think there may be an interesting natural experiment coming up with, I think, some change to the tariff on sugar imports in Europe with the Common Agricultural Policy. I think there's some big change coming up. Harry, you may know about that. So I think there may be an interesting natural experiment there. Also, we're measuring dental health as a key outcome in the evaluation in the UK. What I wanted to ask was, one of the big problems here is that the food system, the food industry, has a particular set of goals, primarily making profit, and our goals are about promoting health, and those are not well aligned. So that's one of the kind of big system level challenges here, which Harry alluded to. And the question really is, you know, we can intervene with a tax of some sort, which, as Harry says, is a kind of perturbation in a complex system and will result in changes that the industry introduces to kind of recalibrate, to achieve an equilibrium in terms of its profit making. So my question really is about can we better align those goals? Is there any scope for that? Is it always going to be a question of us always trying to kind of catch up with industry or trying to outrun industry? Or are there any ways that you can suggest that we might be able to better align those goals?
Well, in the case of, you know, some of the evidence right now, at least we're seeing in terms of shifts in behavior and purchases, we are seeing that there isn't a loss in overall sales, but there's a shift away from the unhealthy beverages towards the bottled waters in particular. So the companies are actually making money from those bottled waters too. It is part of their portfolio. So I think there's an opportunity right there. and it's starting to happen. So hopefully the industry is seeing that writing on the wall and starting to shift their portfolios and their marketing around these products as well.
I'd probably take it back to Donella Meadows and her 12 places to intervene in a system, of which the top is the fundamental paradigm. And you know, we're now in a world where we think it's normal to buy a drink in a disposable bottle, chuck that bottle away. You know, there's a whole domain of sustainability that's not getting included here.
That's true.
And I think, so actually, for long-term sustainability, the entire paradigm needs to change, the business model needs to change. We're not going to achieve that in this room, but I think there is the principle of internalizing the externalities and also tying that in with intergenerational equity, so we're not just chucking stuff away and depriving our grandchildren, ultimately is what's needed to get that realignment.
And do you think industry is going to buy that sort of triple bottom line, or is? I mean, some of them talk about it, but
yeah, I think collectively as a race we have no choice.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take one last question from Deanna Herschel, and that's only because I'm a little bit scared of her. And we'll need to keep the response short, otherwise two of you are going to miss flights. So,
yeah, but I'll be fine.
Yeah.
Okay, this is kind of following up on the systems level change. So if some of the consumption, I know you haven't necessarily mentioned artificially sweetened beverages. Those are not always the most healthful choice. How do you account for that? Or do you need to keep the message focused on sugary beverages?
Well, I guess I would come back here to the kind of 20-year vision thing. There's mixed evidence on artificially sweetened stuff, but probably it's not great. And in a 20-year vision, we'd want to be shifting the whole way that we drink away from that. But you've got to start somewhere. This is a good place to start.
And I would chime in too as a clinician again, because I have these patients in my office saying, reduce your sugary drink consumption. And they say, well, we can't. It's got to be better than artificially flavored or artificial sweeteners. And then basically, there's no evidence that it's bad. Intuitively, it's probably not a good idea to drink chemicals. But on the other hand, we don't have the strong evidence. And when you go against a big beverage, you really do need an evidence base. So right now, unfortunately, I think it kind of escapes our capture.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll add to this is that in some of the locations that have instituted taxes, diet beverages are included in that. So actually, I think the variation in the designs of the tax policies would be kind of interesting to see what the downstream effects will be.
Great.
Thanks.
All right. With that, I'm going to draw this to a close. There's obviously a lot more we could and perhaps should be discussing, but time just doesn't permit, so perhaps we could all pick it up again in Hong Kong with Stephen and his team. And it only remains to thank our three speakers, Shu-Wen, Tom and Harry, for their really interesting presentations. And we've got a small gift for each of you that you can somehow stuff into your case as you run to the airport. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you. Yeah, the knife's going to be a problem.
And folks, that's it for ISBNPA 2017. And again, thank you to those members of the local community who joined us for this session this afternoon. For those of you who are travelling, please travel safe, and we will see you again next year.